The chairlift was running when I pulled into the parking lot, which was a problem because the resort had been closed for 11 months, and the main electrical panel for the lift system was, by every record I had been shown, locked out and tagged out by the previous caretaker before he left in October of the previous year. The lift was the Eagle Ridge Quad, a 4-person chair that ran from the base lodge up to the main mountain bowl, and the chairs were moving at normal operating speed in the moonlight, empty, the cables humming the way they hum when they are under load. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm asking because the time I'm about to describe was 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday in late September. And I want to know how many of you are awake at the kind of hour when machinery that should be off is running by itself. I am 41 years old. I had been hired 3 weeks earlier as the off-season caretaker at Spire Basin Resort, a small independent ski area in the southwestern part of Colorado, in the kind of remote valley that does not get cell service and that requires a 40-minute drive on a Forest Service road from the nearest town. The resort had been closed for the previous winter season because of a financial dispute between the family that owned it and a regional bank that held the operating loan, and the closure had become permanent in March when the family had filed for bankruptcy and the bank had taken possession of the property. The bank was now trying to sell the resort to a buyer, and they needed someone on the property to maintain the buildings and the grounds and to deter vandalism, and they had hired me through a property management company in Denver that handled this kind of off-season caretaking work. The pay was $28 an hour. The job came with on-site housing in the caretaker's cabin, which was a small 2-bedroom building near the base lodge that had been the residence of the previous caretaker, a man named Wesley Kearns, who had held the position for the previous 14 years, including the last 2 years after the resort had closed. The previous caretaker had left in October. The position had been vacant from October through August, when the bank had decided that the unmanned property had become a liability and had hired the management company to find a replacement, and I had been the 3rd person they had offered the position to. The first 2 had accepted, and then had backed out before their start dates, for reasons I had not been told. I had not asked. The pay was good, and I needed the work. The chairlift should not have been running. I sat in my truck in the parking lot with the engine off, and I watched the chairs move for almost 2 minutes. The lift made a steady mechanical sound that was not loud, but was unmistakable in the quiet of the empty resort. The chairs swung slightly as they passed over the support towers. The lights at the base terminal and at the top terminal were on. The lights at the towers in between were on. The whole installation was operating as if the resort were open for business at midnight in late September, which made no sense by any explanation I could construct. I had arrived at the resort at 11:38 p.m. after a 6-hour drive from my previous job site in eastern Utah. I had been delayed by a closed road and had not arrived during business hours, when the management company representative would have met me to walk me through the property. The representative had left a packet of materials in the caretaker's cabin and had given me the cabin key over the phone with instructions on how to find the cabin and how to access the materials. The plan was that I would settle in tonight, read the materials, and meet with the representative the following morning at 9 a.m. for the formal walkthrough. The lift running was not in the plan. I drove from the parking lot to the caretaker's cabin, which was about 200 yards from the base lodge, on a small access road that branched off from the main lot. Yet the cabin was dark. I parked. I got out. I unlocked the cabin door with the key from under the rock the representative had described. I went inside. I turned on the lights. The cabin was clean. The previous caretaker had clearly maintained it. There was a kitchen table with a manila envelope on it, addressed to me with the management company's logo in the corner. I opened the envelope. Inside was a packet of materials. There was a contract I had already signed, copies of the property maps, contact information for the management company, and for various utility services and emergency contacts, a key ring with 23 keys on it, each labeled with a small paper tag, and a separate document, handwritten on yellow legal paper, folded once, with the words "for the next caretaker" on the front in blue ink. Well, I picked up the handwritten document. I unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful. The document was a list, 14 items, numbered, with the title, "Things to Know About Spire Basin," written across the top. I read the first item. The first item said, "The chairlifts are locked out at the main electrical panel in the base lodge. The panel is in the maintenance room behind the ski rental counter. The lockout tags are dated and signed. Do not remove the tags. Do not energize the lifts. The lifts are not to be operated under any circumstances during off-season caretaking. The bank has been informed that the lifts are non-operational, and any operation would create insurance liability that would result in the immediate termination of your contract." I read the item twice. I went to the cabin window, and I looked toward the Eagle Ridge lift, which was visible from the cabin through the trees. The lift was still running. The chairs were still moving. The lights at the towers were still on. I picked up the satellite phone that the management company had left in the cabin, which was the primary means of communication from the resort, because there was no cell service. I dialed the number for the management company representative. The phone rang 4 times and went to a voicemail message that said the office was closed and that I should leave a message. I left a message. I told the representative my name and that I had arrived at the resort and that the Eagle Ridge lift was running, in apparent violation of the lockout, and that I would appreciate a return call as soon as possible. I hung up, and I stood in the cabin and tried to think about what to do. The first item on the list was specific. The first item said the lifts were not to be operated. The first item did not address the situation in which the lifts were already operating without my involvement. I had not energized the lift. I had not removed any tags. I had arrived at the resort and found the lift running. The first item did not give me guidance on what to do in this situation. I read the second item on the list. The second item said, "The base lodge is to be inspected daily. Walk through every room. Check that the doors are locked. Check that the windows are intact. Check that no animals or persons have entered. Log the inspection in the binder in the manager's office. The binder is on the desk." The previous caretaker's entries go back 14 years, and they continue the entries in the same format. The second item did not address the lift either. I read the third item. The third item said, "The maintenance room behind the ski rental counter contains the main electrical panel for the resort. The panel has lockout tags on the lift circuits and on the snowmaking circuits. The tags are red and are signed by Wesley Kearns, the previous caretaker, dated October 14th of the previous year. Do not remove the tags. Do not touch the lockout devices. If you observe that any of the tags or devices have been disturbed, report immediately to the management company and to the local sheriff." The third item was the relevant item. The third item said that if the tags or devices had been disturbed, I was to report to the management company and to the sheriff. And I had already left a voicemail for the management company. I had not called the sheriff. I considered whether to call the sheriff. The sheriff's office, by the contact information in the packet, was 40 minutes away in the nearest town. The sheriff would not arrive quickly. The sheriff would, by my reasonable estimate, ask me a series of questions about why I was reporting an active lift at a closed resort. and I would have to explain that I had just arrived and that the lift was already running and that I did not know who or what had energized it. I decided to inspect the maintenance room myself before calling the sheriff. I wanted to know whether the tags were still in place, in which case the lift was running by some mechanism that bypassed the lockout, or whether the tags had been removed, in which case someone had been in the maintenance room and had operated the panel directly. The two scenarios suggested different problems and would require different responses. I took the keyring from the table. I read the labels on the keys until I found the one labeled Base Lodge Main Entrance. I took my flashlight from the cabin. I left the cabin. I walked the 200 yards to the base lodge. The lift was still running. The chairs were still moving in the moonlight. The cables hummed. I reached the base lodge. The main entrance was a large glass door with the resort's logo etched into it. I unlocked the door with the key. I went inside. The lobby was dark. I turned on my flashlight. The lobby was a large open space with a high ceiling, a stone fireplace at the back, ski racks along one wall, and the ski rental counter on the right side. Behind the rental counter was a door labeled Maintenance. I walked across the lobby to the counter. I went behind it. I tried the maintenance room door. The door was locked. I found the key labeled Maintenance Room on the ring. I unlocked the door. I opened it. The maintenance room was about 20 feet by 15 feet, with concrete floors and exposed pipes and the smell of industrial lubricant. The main electrical panel was on the far wall, a large gray metal cabinet with the manufacturer's name across the top and rows of breakers behind a hinged door. I walked to the panel. I shined my flashlight on the lockout devices. The lockout devices were intact. The red tags were in place. The tags were signed by Wesley Kearns and dated October 14th of the previous year. Yeah, exactly as the list had described. The lockout devices were the kind that physically prevent the breakers from being switched on, with padlocks securing them in the off position. The padlocks were in place. The padlocks had not been cut or removed. The breakers labeled for the Eagle Ridge lift were in the off position, locked out, tagged. The lift, by every indication of the panel, should not have been able to operate. The breakers were off. The circuit was dead. There should have been no electricity flowing to the lift motors. I went back to the lobby. I went to the front door. I opened it. I stepped outside. The lift was still running. I could see the chairs moving from the front of the base lodge. I stood in front of the base lodge for a few minutes, and I tried to think about what was happening. So the lift was running, but the breakers were off. The two facts could not both be true unless the lift was being powered by some source other than the main electrical panel, which I did not know about. The resort had backup generators, but the generators required someone to start them manually, and I had not started them, and there was no one else on the property to start them. I walked back toward the cabin. I walked past the base of the Eagle Ridge lift. The lift was operating normally. The empty chairs were rotating around the bull wheel at the bottom terminal, then traveling up the cable toward the first tower. I watched a chair pass over my head, about 30 feet up. The chair was empty. The safety bar was down. The chair swung slightly as it passed. I noticed something then. The chair that passed over my head had something on the seat. I had not seen it from the cabin window because of the distance and the angle. The thing on the seat was a small object about the size of a grocery bag, dark in color. I could not make out what it was from below. I stayed at the bottom of the lift and watched the next chair come around the bull wheel and start its trip up the cable. The next chair also had something on the seat. The same kind of object, about the size of a grocery bag, dark in color. I watched the next chair. Same object. The next chair. Same object. Every chair on the lift had something on the seat. The objects were all approximately the same size and shape. The chairs were all going up the mountain with their cargo. I could see the chairs returning empty on the other side of the cable, on the downhill run, and then arriving at the bottom terminal empty, then rotating around the bull wheel and arriving at the loading area empty, and then continuing up the lift line again with the objects on the seats. The objects were appearing on the chairs at the loading area. The chairs were arriving empty and leaving full. I was standing about 20 feet from the loading area. I could see the loading area clearly in the lights from the bottom terminal. There was no one at the loading area. The objects were appearing on the chairs without anyone placing them there. I want to be honest about my reaction. My reaction was to back away from the lift slowly without taking my eyes off it. I walked backward for about 50 feet, and then I turned and walked quickly to the cabin. I went inside, I closed the door, I locked the deadbolt, I sat at the kitchen table, and I picked up the satellite phone. I called the management company representative again. I left a longer message this time. I described what I had seen at the lift. I told her I needed to be called back tonight, regardless of the time. I gave her the satellite phone number and the cabin number that was on the materials. I hung up. I picked up the list. I read all 14 items. I read them slowly. I will give you the items that mattered in the order I came to understand why they mattered. The fourth item said, the Eagle Ridge lift, in addition to being locked out electrically, has been further disabled by the removal of the drive belt from the main motor. The belt is in the storage room next to the maintenance room on the second shelf in a labeled box. The lift cannot operate without the belt. This is a redundant precaution, and the previous caretaker took this step in March of the previous year after observing certain conditions that the previous caretaker did not document in detail. The belt should remain in the storage room. Do not reinstall it. If the lift is observed to be operating despite these precautions, do not approach the lift. Stay in the cabin. Call the management company. Call the sheriff if the management company is unreachable. Do not, under any circumstances, get on a chair. I sat at the table and I read the fourth item 3 times. The fourth item was specific to the situation I had just observed. The fourth item told me what to do, which was to stay in the cabin and to call for help. I had already done both of those things, although the management company had not yet responded. And the fourth item also told me that the lift had been disabled in 2 ways, and that the lift operating despite both forms of disabling was a known concern that the previous caretaker had documented. The previous caretaker had not gone into detail about the conditions he had observed that had prompted him to remove the drive belt. The previous caretaker had simply noted that the precaution was necessary and that the situation, if it occurred, should be handled by staying in the cabin and calling for help. The fifth item said, the cabin is the only safe structure on the property during overnight hours. Do not leave the cabin between the hours of 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. unless there is a fire or a medical emergency. The base lodge, the rental shop, the equipment garages, and the various outbuildings should be inspected only during daylight hours. Lock all cabin doors and windows before 10 p.m. The cabin has a backup generator that will provide power if the main electrical service to the cabin is interrupted. The generator is in the small shed attached to the cabin, accessible from inside through the door in the kitchen. Do not exit the cabin to access the generator from outside. use the interior door. I had violated the fifth item. I had been outside the cabin after 10 p.m., walking to the base lodge, inspecting the maintenance room, observing the lift. I had violated it because I had not yet read the fifth item when I had been outside. I had read only the first 3 items before deciding to inspect the maintenance room. I had not known about the fifth item until just now. I checked my watch, as it was 12:14 a.m. I had been outside for approximately 23 minutes after 10 p.m. I had returned to the cabin, but I had been outside during the prohibited window. The sixth item said, "If you observe anything unusual on the property during overnight hours, do not investigate. Log the observation in the cabin logbook, which is in the kitchen drawer next to the refrigerator. Continue your normal routine. Do not exit the cabin until daylight." The previous caretaker has determined, through 14 years of observation, that the unusual phenomena on this property are limited in their behavior and will not directly threaten a person who remains in the cabin and follows the procedures in this list. The phenomena will, however, react to direct attention or attempted intervention. Its direct attention or attempted intervention should be avoided. I had violated the sixth item too. I had observed something unusual at the lift. I had walked to the lift to investigate. I had stood within 20 feet of the loading area and watched the objects appearing on the chairs. I sat at the table and I tried to think about what I had done. I had broken 2 of the items on the list within an hour of arriving at the property. I had broken them because I had not read the list before going outside. I had not read the list because the list had been at the bottom of the materials packet, and I had been focused on the immediate issue of the lift running, which I had not known I was supposed to ignore. I read the rest of the items. The remaining items were practical instructions about the daily routines, the inspections, the maintenance schedules, the supply orders, the snow removal procedures for the access road during winter. The items were the kind of items that a thorough previous caretaker would leave for a new caretaker. The items did not mention the lift again, or the unusual phenomena beyond what was described in items 4 through 6. I went to the kitchen drawer next to the refrigerator. I opened it. I found the cabin logbook. The logbook was a hardbound notebook with lined pages. The first page had the title, "Spire Basin Caretaker's Log," written at the top, with a date below it from 14 years ago. The logbook contained Wesley Kearns' daily entries for 14 years, with brief notes about weather, inspections, maintenance issues, and occasional notes about visitors or contractors who had been on the property. I flipped through the logbook. Most of the entries were brief and practical. Some of the entries had small notations in the margin, similar to the triangles I had read about in another logbook in another location, except these were small dots in red ink. The dots did not appear on every entry. They appeared on entries that were spread out across the 14 years, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months apart. I read the entries with the red dots. The entries were short. They described observations of unusual phenomena on the property. The first dotted entry was from October of 14 years ago, 3 weeks after Wesley had started the position. The entry said, "Eagle Ridge lift was running at 11:47 p.m. Lockout tags on the panel were intact. Returned to cabin and stayed inside. Lift stopped running at approximately 4:30 a.m. and no damage to equipment observed in the morning." The next dotted entry was from December of the same year. The entry said, "Eagle Ridge lift running again, 11:50 p.m. Did not approach. Stayed in cabin. Lift stopped at approximately 4:15 a.m. The previous caretaker before me, who I had spoken with by phone before he left, told me this would happen periodically. He said to stay in the cabin and not to go near the lift. I am following his advice. The dotted entries continued throughout the 14 years. The pattern was consistent. The lift would run on certain nights between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., and Wesley would observe the lift from the cabin window without approaching it, and the lift would stop on its own before sunrise. The entries did not describe the objects on the chairs. Yet the entries simply noted that the lift had been running, and that Wesley had stayed in the cabin, and that the lift had stopped on its own. I checked the dates of the entries. The entries occurred at irregular intervals, but I noticed that they often occurred in clusters, with 2 or 3 entries within a few weeks of each other, followed by months of no entries, followed by another cluster. I tried to identify a pattern in the timing. I could not find one based on the dates alone. The entries did not occur at predictable intervals. I flipped to the most recent entries, from the previous year, to read what Wesley had written in the months before he left. The entries from August through October of the previous year were more frequent than the entries from earlier years. Yet Wesley had been logging unusual observations almost weekly during that period. The entries became more detailed. The entries began to describe additional phenomena beyond the lift running. An entry from August said, "Lift running at 11:42 p.m., observed from the cabin window. Noticed for the first time that the chairs appeared to have something on them as they went up. Could not make out what the objects were from this distance. Did not approach. Lift stopped at 4:08 a.m. An entry from September said, "Lift running at 11:38 p.m. Used binoculars from the cabin window. The objects on the chairs are bags. They look like the kind of canvas bags that are used for laundry or for hauling small items. The bags are dark green or dark blue, hard to tell in the moonlight. The bags are on each chair going up. The chairs are empty coming down. I do not know what is in the bags. I am not going to find out." Lift stopped at 4:22 a.m. An entry from October, dated October 12th, 2 days before Wesley left the position, said, "Lift running at 11:51 p.m. Bags on the chairs as before. I have decided that I am leaving. I have given my notice to the bank. They have agreed to release me from my contract. I am going to remove the drive belt from the lift motor before I leave, on the assumption that the next caretaker will not know to do so. I will note the location of the belt in the document I am preparing. I am also going to leave my own list of instructions, which will include the items I consider essential. The bank's standard caretaker handbook does not include the items related to the unusual phenomena. The bank has not been informed of these phenomena, ditched by my decision and by the decisions of the previous caretakers before me. The phenomena have been managed by the caretaker on site for as long as the resort has been operating, by my understanding from conversations I had with the previous caretaker before me, who had been told about them by the caretaker before him. I am continuing the practice of managing the phenomena privately. I am not certain this is the right choice. I am making it because I do not see what good would come from informing the bank or the public, and I see significant harm. The resort would lose any chance of being sold. The bank would suffer significant financial loss. The previous owners, who are the family that built and operated the resort for 30 years, would lose the remainder of their inheritance from the bankruptcy proceedings. The phenomena, by my 14 years of observation, have not harmed any person who has remained in the cabin and followed the procedures. I am leaving the procedures for the next caretaker to follow. I hope that is sufficient. I read Wesley's last entry 3 times. I sat at the table in the cabin and I tried to think about what I had taken on. The lift was running outside. The objects were on the chairs. The previous caretaker had managed the situation for 14 years by staying in the cabin and not investigating. The previous caretaker had decided not to inform the bank or the public. The previous caretaker had left me a list of instructions and had hoped the instructions would be sufficient. I checked my watch. It was 1:18 a.m. I went to the cabin window that faced the lift. The lift was still running. The chairs were still moving, and the bags were still on the chairs going up the cable. I stood at the window and I watched the lift for a long time. The satellite phone rang. I jumped. I picked it up. The voice on the other end was the management company representative returning my call. She said, "Mr. Halverson, I got your message. I am sorry I missed your call earlier. I had my phone off. What's happening at the property? 2342. I told her about the lift. I told her I had arrived at the property and found the Eagle Ridge lift running, despite the lockout tags being intact at the main electrical panel. I told her I had inspected the maintenance room and verified the tags. I told her I had observed the lift from a distance for several minutes and had noted that the chairs appeared to have objects on them. I did not tell her about the list Wesley had left, or about the cabin logbook, or about the items 4 through 6. I wanted to hear what she said before I disclosed what I had read. The representative was quiet for a moment. She said, "Mr. Halverson, I want to be honest with you. The previous caretaker, Wesley Kearns, had told me when he resigned that there were certain operational issues at the property that he had been managing privately and that he did not want to formally document. He said the issues were not safety hazards in the conventional sense, but that they would sound unusual if I tried to describe them to a new caretaker, and that the new caretaker would either accept his recommendations and continue managing the issues the way he had, or would refuse the position. He said he was leaving a document for the next caretaker that would explain everything. He asked me not to mention the document or the issues during the hiring process. He said he wanted the new caretaker to evaluate the property on its own merits and to make their own decision after reading his document. I asked her if she knew what the issues were. She said, "Hey, I know that he told me the lifts would sometimes run on their own at night, and that the new caretaker should not investigate or try to stop the lifts, and that the lifts would stop on their own. He said this had been happening for the entire time he had been the caretaker, and that the previous caretaker before him had told him about it as well. He said he did not have an explanation for it. He said the property had a history of this kind of phenomenon, and that the caretakers had been managing it privately for decades. He asked me to let the new caretaker handle it the same way. I asked her whether the bank knew about it. She said, "The bank does not know. I did not tell them. Wesley specifically asked me not to. I made the decision to honor his request because I have known Wesley for 14 years and because I trust his judgment. And because the bank's primary interest is in selling the property, and disclosing this kind of issue would make the property impossible to sell. I am telling you now because you have called me and you have observed the lift running, and I do not want you to feel that you are alone in this without context. The context is that this is a known situation that the caretakers have been managing privately, and that you are now the caretaker, and you can choose how to handle it." I asked her what my options were. She said, "Your first option is to continue the practice that Wesley established. You stay in the cabin during the night, you do not investigate the lift, you log your observations in the cabin logbook, and you wait for the lift to stop on its own. The lift will stop on its own." Says Wesley has data going back 14 years showing that this has always happened. You do your normal caretaker duties during the day, you manage the property, you do not tell anyone outside this conversation about what you observe at night. She continued, Your second option is to refuse the position. You can resign tonight, and I will accept your resignation, and we will pay you for the time you spent driving to the property and for the materials you read tonight, and we will find another caretaker. I would understand this option. I would not hold it against you. She continued, your third option is to escalate to the bank. You can tell the bank what you have observed, and the bank can make its own decision about how to proceed. I would advise against this option. The bank does not have any framework for handling this kind of issue. The bank would either dismiss your report as a fabrication and terminate your contract for cause, or would take it seriously and would shut down the sale of the property and would have to disclose the issue to potential buyers, which would devalue the property significantly. Neither outcome would benefit you, and the second outcome would create financial losses for the bank and for the previous owners that I do not think you would want to be responsible for. She continued, your fourth option is to escalate to law enforcement. The same considerations apply. The sheriff would either dismiss the report or would take it seriously and would launch an investigation that would, in either case, end your employment and the sale of the property, and would not, by my understanding, lead to any productive outcome. I asked her what she would do if she were in my position. She said, Mr. Halverson, I am not in your position, and I would not pretend to know what I would do. I will tell you that Wesley managed this for 14 years and was, by every measure I have, a stable and competent person who left the position because he was 63 years old and his wife had health issues that required them to move closer to her family in Phoenix, not because the issues at the property had become unmanageable. The issues, by his account, were not pleasant to live with, but they were manageable. He gave me the impression that he had developed a routine for them, and that the routine had worked for 14 years. I asked her what I should do tonight, given that the lift was already running and I had already observed it. She said, stay in the cabin. And to lock the doors, do not exit the cabin until daylight. Read the rest of Wesley's document if you have not already. The document is more thorough than what I have just told you. Wesley told me he had spent considerable time writing it because he wanted the next caretaker to have everything they would need. Tomorrow morning, if you decide to stay, we can have a longer conversation about the routine. If you decide to leave, I will arrange for the property to be unmanned again until I can find someone else, and I will pay you for your time. The decision is yours. You do not need to decide tonight. I told her I would call her in the morning. She said, one more thing, Mr. Halverson. I want to tell you that you are the third person we have offered this position to. The first two backed out before their start dates. As I think I mentioned to you in the initial phone call, the first two backed out because after we offered them the position, I made the decision to send them advance copies of Wesley's document so that they would know what they were accepting before they accepted it. Both of them read the document and declined the position. I made the decision in your case to not send the document in advance because I had begun to suspect that sending it in advance was preventing me from filling the position, and I wanted to fill the position. I am telling you this because I want you to know that I made a calculated decision that affected your information, and I am sorry for it. I should have sent you the document. I will accept whatever decision you make tonight or tomorrow without any pressure. I thanked her for telling me, and I told her again that I would call her in the morning. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the call. The lift was still running outside. I could hear the faint hum of the cables through the cabin walls if I stopped to listen for it. I tried to think about what I had been told and about what I had observed. The information I had now was that the lift running was a known phenomenon that had been occurring at the resort for decades. The phenomenon had been managed by the caretakers privately, with the knowledge of the management company representative, but without the knowledge of the bank or the previous owners or the public. The phenomenon, by Wesley's 14 years of observation, was limited in its behavior and would not directly threaten a person who remained in the cabin. Yet the phenomenon involved the lift running and the bags appearing on the chairs and the bags going up the mountain. Wesley had not investigated what was in the bags. Wesley had not investigated where the bags went after they reached the top of the lift, because the cabin window did not have a view of the top terminal. Wesley had simply observed the lift from the cabin, logged the observation, and waited for the lift to stop. I considered my options. I considered each of the 4 options the representative had given me. I did not want to refuse the position, because I needed the income and because I had just driven 6 hours to get here, and I did not want to drive back tonight. I did not want to escalate to the bank or to law enforcement. Because the representative had made convincing arguments against both options, and because I did not want to cause financial harm to the previous owners or to be responsible for shutting down the sale of the property. The remaining option was to continue the practice that Wesley had established. The remaining option was to stay in the cabin and to not investigate and to wait for the lift to stop. I made a decision. I decided to stay tonight. I decided to evaluate the situation in the morning and to decide whether to continue beyond the first night based on what I had observed and on how I felt after a few hours of sleep. I did not commit to staying for the long term. I committed only to staying through the night. I read the rest of Wesley's list. The remaining items 7 through 14, they addressed practical aspects of the caretaker job that did not relate to the unusual phenomena. The items covered the snow plowing schedule, the snowmaking system maintenance, the water system inspection, the propane delivery schedule, the wildlife management, the relationships with neighboring property owners, the procedures for emergencies, and the procedures for showings of the property to prospective buyers. The procedures for showings of the property included a specific note. The note said that any showing must be scheduled during daylight hours and must be concluded before 5 p.m. The note said that the bank's real estate broker had been informed of this constraint and had agreed to it without questioning the reason. The note said that if a prospective buyer asked to see the property after dark, the caretaker should refuse the request and should refer the buyer back to the broker for rescheduling. The note said that this constraint had been in place for at least the past 2 decades, by Wesley's understanding from his predecessor. I read the note twice. I considered the implication. The implication was that the unusual phenomena were not limited to the lift running. The implication was that there were additional phenomena that occurred after dark, and that the caretakers had developed a general policy of keeping people away from the property after dark in order to manage the phenomena, and that the policy had been incorporated into the procedures for showing the property to buyers. I went back to the cabin window. The lift was still running. I checked my watch. It was 2:31 a.m. The lift had been running for almost 3 hours by my estimate, although I had only been observing it for the past few hours. I noticed something new at the lift. The objects on the chairs going up the mountain were no longer the only objects I could see. The chairs returning from the top, on the downhill side of the cable, which had been empty when I had first observed the lift, were now also carrying objects. The downhill chairs were arriving at the bottom terminal, rotating around the bull wheel and continuing up the cable. The objects on the downhill chairs were different from the objects on the uphill chairs. The uphill objects were the canvas bags Wesley had described. The downhill objects were smaller and harder to identify in the moonlight. I went to the kitchen drawer. I found a pair of binoculars in the drawer next to the logbook. I took the binoculars to the window. I focused on a chair that was descending the cable. The chair had a small object on the seat. The object was not a bag. The object was a piece of clothing. It looked like a single shoe, or possibly a single boot, sitting upright on the seat as if a person had been wearing it and had left it behind. I focused on the next descending chair. The next chair had a similar object, a single shoe. The next chair had a glove. The next chair had what looked like a folded wallet. The downhill chairs were carrying personal items. The personal items were arriving at the bottom terminal. I could not see what happened to the items at the bottom terminal because the loading area was partially obstructed by the bullwheel housing, and I could only see the items on the chairs as they came down the cable. I lowered the binoculars. I stepped back from the window. I sat down at the table. I picked up the satellite phone. I called the management company representative back. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message. I told her about the items on the downhill chairs. I asked her whether Wesley had ever mentioned the downhill chairs in any of his communications with her. I asked her to call me back when she could. I did not expect a return call quickly. I had called her at 2:36 a.m. I expected she was asleep. I went back to the window. I watched the lift. I noticed that the bags on the uphill chairs were getting larger. The bags I had observed earlier had been about the size of a grocery bag. The bags I was observing now were larger, closer to the size of a duffel bag. The bags were filled with something. The bags were not flat or empty. I focused the binoculars on a chair that was passing over the first tower above the loading area. The bag on the chair was clearly a duffel bag, dark in color, full of something that gave it a rounded shape. The bag was strapped to the seat with what looked like a length of rope or cord, securing it so that it would not fall off during the trip up the mountain. I had not been able to see the straps from the cabin window without the binoculars. I had not been able to see the size of the bags. The bags had been getting larger, and the bags had been getting more elaborate in their securing, while I had been observing the lift over the past 3 hours. I went back to the cabin logbook. I flipped through Wesley's entries, and I looked for any mention of the downhill chairs. I looked for any mention of the bags getting larger. I looked for any mention of the personal items. I found one entry from June of the previous year that mentioned the downhill chairs. The entry said, "Lift running at 11:48 p.m. Bags on uphill chairs as before. Tonight is the first time I have observed objects on the downhill chairs. I have not seen this before. The objects appear to be small personal items, possibly clothing or accessories. I do not know what to make of this. I am noting it for the record. I am not going to investigate. Lift stopped at 4:34 a.m. The entry did not include any follow-up. There was no entry that indicated Wesley had seen the downhill objects again. I flipped through the subsequent entries. The entries from July, August, September, and October all mentioned the lift running, but did not mention the downhill chairs. Either Wesley had stopped logging the downhill chairs, or the downhill chairs had not appeared again during his remaining months at the property. I considered the possibility that what I was observing tonight was a new escalation in the phenomenon. The lift running was something that had been happening for 14 years by Wesley's records, and possibly longer by his predecessors' accounts. The bags on the uphill chairs were something Wesley had first observed in August of the previous year, only 2 months before he left. The downhill objects had been observed by Wesley only once, in June of the previous year. The bags getting larger and being secured with straps was something I had not seen mentioned in Wesley's logs at all. I was, by every indication, observing a phenomenon that was changing in real time, with the changes occurring at intervals of months or years, and with each change adding new elements to the basic pattern. I checked my watch. It was 3:14 a.m. The lift had been running for over 3 hours. By Wesley's records, the lift typically stopped between 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. I had less than an hour and a half before the expected stopping time. I sat at the table and I watched the cabin window from across the room. I did not want to keep going to the window because I was concerned about the 6th item on Wesley's list, which had said that the phenomena would react to direct attention. I had been giving the phenomena considerable direct attention for the past several hours. I had used binoculars. I had observed individual bags and individual personal items. And I had identified that the bags were getting larger and were being secured with straps. I had, by any reasonable interpretation of direct attention, given the phenomena more attention than Wesley had given them in any of his 14 years. I considered whether the changes I was observing were a result of my attention. I considered whether the phenomena were responding to me, specifically in ways they had not responded to Wesley. I had been at the property for less than 5 hours. I had observed the lift for less than 3 of those hours. I had no baseline for comparing the phenomana's behavior under different conditions. I could not determine, from the limited data available, in whether the changes I was observing were the result of my attention or whether they were the natural progression of a phenomenon that had been escalating slowly for some time. I made a decision. I decided to stop watching the lift. I decided to close the curtains on the cabin windows, to turn off most of the lights in the cabin, to sit at the kitchen table with the satellite phone in front of me, and to wait for daylight without giving the phenomena any further attention. I closed the curtains. I turned off all the lights except for the small lamp on the kitchen table. I sat at the table. I tried to read a book that was on the kitchen counter, a paperback novel that had apparently belonged to Wesley. I could not focus on the book. I kept listening for the sound of the lift. I could hear the faint hum of the cables, although muffled now by the closed curtains and the cabin walls. At 3:47 a.m., the satellite phone rang. I jumped. I picked it up. The voice on the other end was the management company representative. She said, "Mr. Halverson, I just listened to your second message. I am sorry to be calling so late. I want to tell you what I know about the downhill chairs, and I want to tell you something else that I should have told you in our earlier conversation." I told her to go ahead. She said, "Wesley mentioned the downhill chairs to me once, in a phone call last summer. He said he had observed something on the downhill chairs that he had not observed before, and that he was going to log it, but was not going to investigate it. He told me he was concerned that the phenomenon was changing in ways he could not predict. Yet he told me that he had been at the property for 13 years at that point, and that the phenomenon had been stable for most of those 13 years, and that the recent changes were the first significant departure from the established pattern. He told me he was beginning to think about retirement, partly because of his wife's health, and partly because he did not want to be the caretaker if the phenomenon continued to change in unpredictable ways." She said, "I want to tell you that Wesley left the position 3 months earlier than he had originally planned. He had told me in July that he was going to retire at the end of January, after the winter season. In October, he called me and told me he needed to leave immediately. He did not give me a detailed reason. Yet he said only that the situation at the property had changed and that he was no longer comfortable being the caretaker. He said he was sorry to leave the position vacant, but that he had to go. I asked him what had changed. He said he could not describe it adequately on the phone. He said it would be in the document he was leaving for the next caretaker. He said the next caretaker would understand if they read the document carefully. I told her I had read the document. I told her there was nothing in the document about a recent change that had caused Wesley to leave early. I asked her if Wesley had left any other materials. She said, "I do not know. The document was the only thing he told me about." He may have left other materials at the cabin that I am not aware of. He had access to the cabin throughout his 14 years and could have left anything he wanted. I would suggest you look through the cabin carefully, particularly in places where you might not have looked yet. I asked her about the second thing she had wanted to tell me. She said, "The second thing is about the previous caretakers before Wesley. I told you that the phenomenon had been managed privately by the caretakers for decades. I did not tell you that the previous caretaker before Wesley, a man named Henry Voss, did not retire. Henry left the position in 2010 because he had a stroke at the property. His body was found in the cabin by Wesley, who had been hired to replace him. The death was attributed to natural causes. Henry was 68 years old. There was no investigation beyond the standard medical examination. Yet the bank at the time did not know about the phenomenon, and there was no reason for anyone to connect the death to anything unusual at the property. I am telling you because you should know. Wesley told me about Henry's death about a year after he started, when he had developed enough trust in me to share the information. She continued, "The caretaker before Henry, a man named Frank Whitaker, also did not retire in the conventional sense. Frank left the position in 1996 because he was institutionalized for what was described at the time as a psychiatric breakdown. The bank's records describe Frank's departure as a medical leave that became permanent. Frank lived for another 12 years in a facility in Grand Junction. Wesley spoke with him on the phone twice during those 12 years, and after Wesley had taken over the caretaker position. Wesley told me that Frank was lucid in their conversations and was able to discuss the phenomenon at the property in detail, but that Frank's institutional records describe him as having severe psychiatric symptoms that prevented him from living independently. Wesley believed that Frank had been institutionalized partly because Frank had tried to tell the authorities about the phenomenon, and the authorities had interpreted his accounts as symptoms of a mental health crisis. Wesley believed that Frank had not actually been mentally ill. Wesley believed that Frank had been a competent caretaker who had been overwhelmed by the phenomenon and had made the mistake of trying to report it. I asked her how Wesley had known about Frank's institutionalization. She said, "Yes, Wesley had met Frank during the handoff between Henry and Wesley. Frank had not been the caretaker that Henry had taken over from. Henry had taken over from a different caretaker, a woman named Patricia Lynn, who had retired conventionally after 23 years at the property in 1989. Patricia had introduced Henry to the phenomenon during the handoff. Henry had, in turn, learned about Frank from Patricia, who had been the caretaker before Frank had been the caretaker before Patricia. The caretakers, by my understanding from Wesley, had developed a private network for sharing information about the phenomenon, going back at least to the 1960s. The network operated independently of the bank or the previous owners, and the network passed information from caretaker to caretaker through personal conversations and through documents like the one Wesley left for you. I asked her how many caretakers had been at the property over the years. She said, "I do not know exactly. I would estimate, based on what Wesley told me, that there have been somewhere between 8 and 12 caretakers at the property since the phenomenon began to be documented in the network. Some of them retired conventionally. Some of them did not. Wesley told me about 3 who did not retire conventionally. Henry, who died of a stroke at the cabin, Frank, who was institutionalized, and one before Frank, a man whose name Wesley did not give me, who left the property without notice and was never heard from again. Wesley told me about that one in our last phone call, before he resigned. He said he was telling me because he wanted me to know that not all of the caretakers who had encountered the phenomenon had been able to manage it. He said most had managed it, some had not. He said the difference between those who had managed it and those who had not was, in his judgment, related to whether they had been able to refrain from investigating. I asked her what she meant. She said, "Wesley told me that the caretakers who had refrained from investigating the phenomenon had, by his understanding from the network's collective memory, retired conventionally, or had at least left the position alive and functional. The caretakers who had attempted to investigate the phenomenon had, in some cases, suffered consequences." Henry, before his stroke, had told Wesley that he had once gone to the top of the lift during a daylight inspection, after a night when the lift had been running. Henry had wanted to see whether there was any evidence of what the bags had contained or where they had been delivered. Henry had not found any evidence. The top terminal had been clean. There had been nothing unusual to observe. Henry had returned to the cabin and had logged the inspection as routine. Henry's stroke had occurred 2 weeks later. Wesley believed that Henry's investigation, even though it had not yielded any results, had been the trigger for the stroke. Wesley believed that the phenomenon had reacted to Henry's attention by, in some way, affecting Henry's health. She said, "I am telling you this because you are now in a position where you have observed the phenomenon and you have given it considerable attention. I do not know whether you are at risk. I do not have any way to assess the risk. I am telling you because Wesley would have wanted me to tell you. He said in his last call that if the next caretaker called me with questions about the phenomenon, I should share everything I knew, even if it would make the position less attractive. He said the next caretaker deserved to know what they were dealing with. I sat at the table with the satellite phone pressed to my ear, and I tried to absorb what she was telling me. The lift was still running outside. The bags were still going up the mountain. The personal items were still coming back down. And Wesley had left the position 3 months early because something had changed that he had not been able to manage. Henry had died of a stroke after investigating the top terminal. Frank had been institutionalized after trying to report the phenomenon. An earlier caretaker had simply disappeared. I asked her what time the lift typically stopped running. She said, "Wesley told me it usually stopped between 4 and 4:30 in the morning. He said the timing was variable, but that it had always stopped before sunrise." I checked my watch. It was 4:08 a.m. I had less than an hour, by Wesley's data, before the lift was supposed to stop. I told her I would call her in the morning. I asked her if it would be all right if I called her early, around 6 or 7 a.m. She said yes. She said I could call her any time. She told me to lock the cabin doors and to stay inside. We hung up. I sat at the table. I did not move. I did not look at the window. I did not turn on any additional lights. I waited. At 4:31 a.m., the hum of the lift cables stopped. I could feel the cessation in the cabin walls, the absence of the vibration that had been continuous for the past several hours. The cabin was suddenly quiet. I waited for 10 minutes before I went to the window. I parted the curtain about an inch and I looked out at the lift. The lift was stopped. The chairs were stationary. The lights at the towers and at the terminals were off. The lift looked exactly as it had looked when I had driven into the parking lot, except that I now knew it had been running for almost 5 hours and that something had been moving up and down the mountain on it during that time. I let the curtain fall. I sat back down at the table. I waited for sunrise. The sun came up at 6:47 a.m. I waited another hour until 7:50 a.m. before I called the management company representative again. She picked up on the second ring. She said, "Mr. Halverson, are you still at the property?" I told her I was. I told her the lift had stopped at 4:31 a.m. I told her I had stayed in the cabin through sunrise. I told her I had not slept. I told her I needed to think about what I was going to do. She said, "I am going to come up to the property today. I had not planned to come up today, but given the circumstances, I think I should be there in person to walk you through the property and to discuss your options. I can be there by noon. Can you stay until then?" I told her I could. I told her I had not yet decided whether I was going to continue in the position. She said, "I understand. We can discuss it when I arrive. In the meantime, I would suggest you do not leave the cabin except to come to the parking lot when I arrive. So I would suggest you do not inspect the lift or the base lodge or any other building on the property. Whatever happened last night happened. The phenomenon is on its standard schedule of being inactive during daylight hours by Wesley's records. You should be safe to remain in the cabin during the day. But I would not push it by going to look at things." I agreed. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee. I tried to eat something. I could not eat. I drank coffee and I watched the clock on the kitchen wall, and I waited for noon. At 11:47 a.m., I heard a vehicle on the access road. I went to the cabin window that faced the parking lot. A small SUV was pulling into the lot. The SUV parked next to my truck. A woman got out. She was in her early 50s, with short gray hair, wearing jeans and a heavy jacket. Said that she walked across the lot toward the cabin. I opened the cabin door. I stepped onto the small porch. The woman walked up to the porch and held out her hand. She said, "Mr. Halverson, I'm Diane Castellanos. We've been speaking on the phone." I shook her hand. I told her to come in. We sat at the kitchen table. I made her a cup of coffee. She put a folder on the table. She did not open it immediately. She said, "Before we discuss anything else, I want to tell you that I have made some decisions since we last spoke. I have decided that I am going to inform the bank about the phenomenon. I have decided this because I think Wesley was wrong to keep it private, and because I think I was wrong to honor his request. The previous caretakers may have managed the phenomenon individually for decades, but the management has resulted in deaths and institutionalizations and a person who simply disappeared, and the management has continued because the caretakers and the property managers have made decisions based on what they perceived to be the practical interests of the bank and the previous owners. I have come to think that those decisions were not the right decisions. I have come to think that the bank and the previous owners and the public have a right to know what is happening at this property, and that the financial and reputational consequences of disclosure are not my responsibility to weigh against the moral consequences of continued concealment." She paused. She drank from her coffee. She said, "I am telling you this because the decision affects you. If I disclose the phenomenon to the bank will likely close the property to all human occupation immediately. The position you were hired for will not exist. You will be paid for the time you have spent here, plus a severance equivalent to 2 weeks of work, and you will be released from your contract. You will not have to make a decision about whether to continue. The decision will have been made for you. I am telling you because I want to give you the opportunity to disagree with my decision before I act on it. I am going to make the disclosure regardless of what you say, but I want you to have the chance to express your views, since the decision affects your livelihood." I sat at the table and I tried to think. I had been awake for over 30 hours. I was tired in a way that made it difficult to process what she was telling me. And I asked her why she had made the decision. She said, "I made the decision after I got off the phone with you at 4 a.m. I sat in my house and I thought about everything I had told you. I thought about Henry and Frank and the unnamed caretaker who disappeared. I thought about Wesley leaving 3 months early because something had changed. I thought about you having driven 6 hours to a property I had not properly disclosed to you and observing a phenomenon that I knew about and had not warned you about. I thought about the next caretaker after you, and the one after that, and the one after that, all of them being put in the same position, with each of them experiencing a phenomenon that, by every indication, has been escalating over the past 2 years. I decided that I could not continue to be a part of the concealment. I decided that I would rather face the professional and legal consequences of disclosing the phenomenon than continue to be the person who recruited caretakers into a situation that had a documented history of harming them. She continued, I want to tell you that I have been the property manager for this resort for 19 years. I have hired 4 caretakers in that time, including you. The first caretaker I hired was Wesley, who lasted 14 years. The second was Wesley's intended replacement, who I hired in October of last year and who left after 1 week before I had sent her Wesley's document. She did not give me a detailed reason. She said only that the property was not what she had expected. The third was a man named Robert, who I hired in February of this year. I sent Robert the document before he started. Robert read the document and accepted the position. Robert was at the property for 3 weeks. He left in March. He did not give me a detailed reason either. He sent me a brief email saying that he could not continue and that he was sorry. The fourth is you. I did not send you the document because I was running out of options and I needed someone to take the position. And I had concluded from the experiences of the second and third caretakers that sending the document in advance was preventing me from filling the position. I made a calculation. The calculation was that I would rather have you arrive at the property and discover the phenomenon on your own than continue to leave the property unmanned. The calculation was wrong. I should not have made it. I should have continued to send the document and to let candidates make informed decisions. I am sorry. I told her I appreciated the apology. I asked her what she meant when she said the phenomenon had been escalating over the past 2 years. She said, Wesley's documentation, by his own description, showed a stable phenomenon for the first 12 years he was at the property. The lift would run on certain nights. The lift would stop on its own. Wesley would log the observation and continue with his work. The phenomenon did not change in any significant way for those 12 years. In year 13, in the summer of last year, the phenomenon began to change. The bags appeared on the chairs. The bags became larger over the following months. The downhill objects appeared in June of last year. By October, when Wesley left, the phenomenon was, by his account, no longer stable. He could not predict what would happen on any given night. He felt that the phenomenon was building towards something that he could not identify, and that he did not want to be present for whatever that something was. He left the property and he did not look back. He has not, by my knowledge, returned to the property since. She continued, what you observed last night was, by your description, a further escalation. The bags being secured with straps. The bags being significantly larger than what Wesley had described in his last entries. The downhill objects continuing to appear when Wesley had observed them only once in June. The phenomenon is continuing to change. The phenomenon is, by every indication, heading towards something. I do not know what. I do not want you, or any future caretaker, to be present when the phenomenon reaches whatever it is heading toward. I asked her how the bank was going to respond when she made the disclosure. She said, I do not know. I expect they will close the property. They may also terminate my contract with their management company. They may also pursue legal action against me for failing to disclose the phenomenon when I became aware of it. I am prepared for those outcomes. I have spoken with a lawyer this morning. I have an appointment with the lawyer for Monday. I am going to tell the bank on Monday afternoon, after I have completed the legal consultation. I am going to give you the weekend to make any preparations you need to make. I would suggest you leave the property today after we finish this conversation, just in that you find temporary accommodations while you figure out your next steps. I asked her about the previous owners. She said, I will tell the previous owners after I tell the bank. The previous owners are the Whitfield family. They built and operated the resort for 30 years before the bankruptcy. They are still in the area. They have not, by my knowledge, ever known about the phenomenon. The caretakers and the property managers and the bank's representatives have all kept it from them. I think the Whitfields have a right to know what was happening at their property during the years they operated it. I think they have a right to know whether the phenomenon was occurring during the operating years and was being managed by the staff without their knowledge, or whether the phenomenon began only after the closure. I think they have a right to ask whether any of their guests over the years were affected by the phenomenon. I asked her whether she thought the phenomenon had affected any of the guests. She said, I do not know. I have wondered about it. The resort operated for 30 years. Hundreds of thousands of skiers came through the property during those years. The lift operated continuously during the operating seasons. If the phenomenon was active during those years, it would have been operating alongside the normal operations of the resort, and the staff would have had to manage it in a different way than the off-season caretakers have managed it. I do not know whether that is what happened. I do not know whether the off-season behavior of the lift is the same as any potential operating season behavior. But this off-season behavior may be a manifestation that occurs only when the resort is empty, and the lift may have been ordinary during the operating seasons. Or the lift may have been doing something throughout the operating years that the staff was managing in some way I am not aware of. I do not have access to records from the operating years. The Whitfields would have those records, if they exist. I sat at the table and I tried to think about the implications. The phenomenon had been documented at the property since at least the 1960s by the network of caretakers Diane had described. The resort had operated commercially from 1989, when the Whitfields had built it, through the previous winter season, when the financial dispute had closed it. The phenomenon had been occurring during the operating years. That if the off-season behavior of the lift was not the only manifestation of the phenomenon, then the operating season manifestations had been occurring while paying customers were on the property. The customers had been riding the same lift that was now, in the off-season, transporting bags up the mountain at night. I asked Diane whether she knew of any incidents during the operating years that might have been related to the phenomenon. She said, I have not researched it. I have considered researching it. I have been afraid of what I might find. I think if I do disclose the phenomenon to the bank and to the Whitfields, the question of whether there were operating season incidents will be one of the first questions that gets raised. The Whitfields will want to know. The bank will want to know. The investigators, if there are any, will want to know. The records of guest incidents over 30 years will be examined. I do not know what those records will show. I would prefer not to speculate. I asked her whether the resort had had a history of guest fatalities or disappearances during the operating years. She said, the resort had the standard ski resort incident rate. There were skiing accidents. There were a small number of fatalities over the 30 years, all of them attributed to skiing-related causes. There were also, by my recollection from working with the property in the years before the closure, a few cases of guests who had been reported missing on the mountain and who had not been found. I do not remember the exact number. I would estimate 3 or 4 over the 30 years. As the cases were investigated by the local sheriff's office and were attributed to guests who had skied out of bounds and had become lost in the surrounding wilderness, which was a known risk at the resort because of the difficult terrain and the limited boundary marking. The cases were closed without resolution. The bodies were never found. She continued, "I am not telling you this because I think the missing guests were related to the phenomenon. I am telling you because you asked, and because I have decided to be honest with you about what I know. I do not know whether the missing guests were related to the phenomenon. I have wondered about it. I have not investigated. The investigation will be one of the things that happens after I make the disclosure. The investigation will not be conducted by me. It will be conducted by whoever the bank and the Whitfields and the sheriff and possibly the state determine should conduct it. I will provide whatever information I have. I will not be the one drawing conclusions." I sat at the table for a long time after she finished speaking. The cabin was quiet. The morning light was coming through the windows. The lift outside was stationary. I told Diane that I agreed with her decision. I told her I thought she should disclose the phenomenon to the bank and to the Whitfields. I told her I did not need the weekend to make preparations. I told her I would pack up my things and leave the property today, as soon as we finished the conversation. I told her I did not want to spend another night at the property. She thanked me. She told me she would process my final paycheck within the week. She told me she would include the severance she had described. She told me she would be available if I had any further questions or if I wanted to be involved in the disclosure process. She said, "There is one more thing I want to ask you. I am going to be making a statement to the bank and to the Whitfields. I am going to need to describe what I know about the phenomenon. I have Wesley's documentation. I have my own observations from my conversations with Wesley over the years. I have what you told me on the phone last night. I would like to have a written statement from you, describing what you observed at the property in the past day. I would like to include your statement in the materials I provide to the bank. Your statement would document the most recent escalation of the phenomenon. Your statement would be the most up-to-date evidence available. I am asking, you can refuse. If you refuse, I will not include your statement, and I will not mention you by name in any of the materials. I will say only that the property's most recent caretaker observed an escalation and resigned. I will not identify you. I told her I would write the statement. I told her I thought she should have it. I told her I did not want to be the person who held back evidence that could help the investigation. She thanked me. She gave me her business card. She told me to email the statement to her by the end of the week. She stood up. She put on her jacket. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle. She turned back. She said, "Mr. Halverson, I want to ask you something else. I want to ask you whether you would be willing to come back to the property next week with me in daylight for a final inspection. I would like to have a witness when I do my own inspection of the property before the disclosure. I am going to inspect the base lodge and the maintenance room and the lift terminals and the surrounding areas. I am going to look for any physical evidence of the phenomenon that I have not previously documented. I would like to have someone with me. I am asking you because you have already observed the phenomenon and because you would be able to identify anything that connects to what you saw last night. I am also asking you because I do not want to do the inspection alone. I will pay you for your time. The inspection would take half a day. I would compensate you for travel and for the inspection time." I considered the request. I had just told her I did not want to spend another night at the property. I had been planning to leave today and to not return. The request was that I return next week, in daylight, to help her with an inspection. The request did not involve another overnight stay. The request was for a daylight inspection that would be conducted with another person present. I told her I would think about it. I told her I would let her know by the end of the week. When I sent her my statement, she thanked me. She left. I watched from the cabin window as she walked back to her SUV. She got in. She drove out of the parking lot. The dust from the access road hung in the air for a long time after she was gone. I packed up my belongings. I had not unpacked much since I had only been at the property for one night. I loaded my truck. I made a final walkthrough of the cabin to check that I had not forgotten anything. I locked the cabin. I put the key under the rock where the representative had told me it was kept. I drove out of the parking lot. I drove down the access road. I looked in my rearview mirror as I drove. The base lodge and the lift terminals were visible behind me, getting smaller as I drove further from the property. The Eagle Ridge lift was stationary. The chairs hung in their parked positions. The property looked exactly like a closed ski resort in the off-season, with no indication that anything unusual had occurred there in the past 24 hours. I drove to a motel in the nearest town. I checked in. I went to my room. I lay down on the bed. I slept for 14 hours. Yet I want to tell you what happened in the days and weeks that followed, because the days and weeks that followed are the part of the story that I have not told anyone, and the part that I am recording now because I have decided that the record needs to exist. I wrote the statement for Diane on Wednesday of that week. I emailed it to her on Thursday. I did not commit in the email to participating in the inspection she had asked about. I told her I was still thinking about it. I asked her to give me until the following Monday to decide. Diane called me on Friday morning. She had received my statement and had reviewed it. She said the statement was thorough and would be useful. She said she had scheduled her meeting with the bank for Monday afternoon. She said she was going to make the disclosure and provide the materials, that including my statement. She said she would call me Monday evening to let me know how the meeting had gone. She did not call me Monday evening. I called her on Tuesday morning. She did not pick up. I left a voicemail. I called her again Tuesday afternoon. She did not pick up. On Wednesday morning, I received an email from a different person at the management company. The email informed me that Diane Castellanos was no longer with the company. The email did not provide any details about her departure. The email said that the company would be in touch shortly regarding the status of my employment at the property and the processing of my final paycheck. I called the management company. I asked to speak with whoever had sent the email. I was connected to a man named Greg. Greg said he was the regional director of the management company and that he had taken over Diane's accounts effective Tuesday morning. He said he could not discuss the circumstances of Diane's departure. He said he could only discuss the practical matters related to the property and to my employment. I asked him about the disclosure to the bank. I asked him whether the bank had been informed of the phenomenon at the property. Greg said, "Mr. Halverson, I am not aware of any phenomenon at the property. I have reviewed the property file, and I do not see any documentation that would support the description you are giving. The property is a closed ski resort that is being maintained by our company on behalf of the bank. There are no operational issues with the property that I am aware of. If Ms. Castellanos discussed any issues with you, those discussions were not documented in the company's records." I asked him about Wesley's document. I asked him whether the document was in the property file. Greg said, "The property file contains the standard caretaker handbook that we provide to all caretakers. The handbook covers the routine duties and procedures for the position. There is no document by Wesley Kearns in the file that I am aware of. If such a document existed, it should have been left at the property by the previous caretaker for the next caretaker to find. Did you find a document at the property? I told him I had found a document. I told him the document was on the kitchen table when I arrived at the cabin. Greg said, "Mr. Halverson, I would suggest you return that document to the property. It does not belong to you. It is property of the management company and ultimately of the bank. If you have removed it from the property, please return it. I will arrange for someone to collect it from you if you cannot return it yourself." I told him I had not removed the document. I told him the document was at the cabin, where I had left it when I checked out. Greg said, "Then there is no issue. I will have someone retrieve the document during the next inspection of the property." I asked him about the inspection that Diane had wanted to do with me. I asked him whether the inspection was still planned. Greg said, "There is no inspection planned beyond the routine inspections that our company conducts as part of the standard caretaker management. I am not aware of any special inspection that Ms. Castellanos may have discussed with you. Yet, if you discussed an inspection with her, it was not authorized by the company and would not have been part of your duties. I would not advise you to return to the property." I asked him about my final paycheck and the severance. Greg said, "Your employment ended on the morning you left the property. You will be paid for the hours you worked, which by our records was less than 24 hours. There is no severance because there was no termination by the company. You voluntarily left the position. The amount we owe you will be processed within the next 2 weeks. I have your address on file." I asked him about the next caretaker. I asked him whether the company had hired a replacement for me. Greg said, "The company is in the process of evaluating the property's caretaking needs. I cannot discuss specific personnel decisions. And I would suggest you focus on your next employment opportunity rather than concerning yourself with the property's future operations. Your involvement with the property has ended." I told him I appreciated his time. I hung up. I sat in my motel room and I tried to think about what had happened. Diane was gone. The disclosure she had been planning to make on Monday had apparently not happened, or had happened in some form that had resulted in her removal from the company. Wesley's document, which had been on the kitchen table at the cabin, was now considered by the management company to be a disputed item that might or might not exist. My employment had ended. I had been told not to return to the property. I tried to call Diane on her personal cell phone, which she had given me on her business card. Yet the number went to a generic voicemail message that did not identify her. I left a message asking her to call me back. She did not call me back. I tried again the next day. Same result. I tried for the rest of the week. I did not hear from her. On Friday of that week, I drove to Diane's office in Denver. I had her business card with the office address. The office was in a small commercial building in a suburban area. I went to the suite number on the card. The suite was occupied by a different business, a small accounting firm. The receptionist at the accounting firm told me they had been in the suite for 3 years and that they were not aware of any property management company at that address. I asked her whether she knew Diane Castellanos. She said she did not. I went back to my motel. I tried to research Diane online. Yes, I could not find any record of her employment with the management company. I could not find any record of the management company itself, beyond a basic website that listed a different address from the one on her card, and that did not include Diane in its list of staff. I called the company's main number again. I asked for Diane. The receptionist who answered told me that no one by that name was employed by the company. I want to tell you what I have done in the 3 weeks since Diane disappeared from the management company's records, because the 3 weeks are the part of this story that I am still living, and the part that I have been documenting in this recording in the hopes that someone, someday, will find it useful. I drove back to the resort on the second weekend after Diane disappeared from the management company's records. I drove during the day. I arrived at the property at 1 p.m. in good light, with a full tank of gas in my truck and a packed bag in case I needed to leave quickly. I had told no one I was going. I had not asked permission from the management company. I had been told by Greg not to return to the property, and I was returning anyway. I parked at the edge of the parking lot, near the access road, in a position where my truck would be ready to drive away if I needed to leave in a hurry. I walked across the lot to the cabin. The cabin door was unlocked. I had locked it when I left. The key was no longer under the rock where I had placed it. I went inside. The cabin was empty. The kitchen table was clean. The manila envelope with my name on it was gone. The cabin logbook was gone from the kitchen drawer. The list Wesley had left was gone. The satellite phone was gone. Every document and item that had been associated with the unusual aspects of the property had been removed. The cabin had been reduced to a basic furnished space, with the standard caretaker handbook from the management company sitting on the kitchen counter where Wesley's list had been. Someone had been in the cabin since I left. Someone had removed the materials. I did not know who. I did not know when. I walked across the property to the base lodge. The lodge was locked. I did not have a key. I walked around the building. I looked through the windows. The lobby looked the same as it had when I had inspected it during my first night. I could see the ski rental counter and the door to the maintenance room. The door to the maintenance room was closed. I walked to the base of the Eagle Ridge lift. The lift was stationary. The chairs hung in their parked positions. The bottom terminal was quiet. I walked along the lift line for about 100 yards, looking at the ground beneath the cable and the support towers. I was looking for any evidence of what had been transported on the lift during the nights it had been operating. I did not find any evidence. The ground was clean. There were no items, no debris, no marks of any kind. I walked back to the bottom terminal. I looked at the loading area where the bags had appeared on the chairs. The loading area was a concrete pad with worn paint marking the loading position. There was nothing on the pad. There was no sign that anything had ever been loaded there. I walked up the access road to the access road junction with the lift line, where there was a service road that ran parallel to the lift up the mountain. I had not walked up the service road during my first night. I had not walked anywhere on the property during the daytime because I had left in the morning after the night the lift had been running. I decided to walk up the service road for some distance to see whether I could observe anything along the lift line that would give me information about the phenomenon. I walked up the service road for about a quarter mile. The road was a dirt road, wide enough for a maintenance vehicle, with the lift cable visible to my right through the trees. I passed the first support tower for the lift. I passed the second support tower. Yes, I continued walking. The terrain became steeper as I went. I was beginning to feel the altitude. About a half mile up the service road, I came to a clearing on the left side of the road. The clearing was small, maybe 40 feet across, with a single building in the middle. The building was a small wooden structure, about the size of a tool shed, with a peaked roof and a single door. The building was old. The wood was weathered. The building was not on any of the property maps that had been in the materials packet. I walked to the building. The door was secured with a padlock. The padlock was old and rusted, but it was intact. I did not have the key. I walked around the building. There were no windows. There was no other entrance. I went back to the door. I tested the padlock. The padlock held. I tested the door. The door did not move. Yet the building was sealed. I noticed something on the ground near the door. The ground in front of the door had been disturbed recently. The dirt was darker in a patch about 3 feet wide and 4 feet long, immediately in front of the door, as if something had been dragged across it. The disturbance was fresh. It had not been there long enough for the surrounding vegetation to grow back over it. I followed the disturbance with my eyes. The disturbance led from the door of the building toward the lift line. which was about 30 yards away. I walked along the path of the disturbance. The dirt was darker for about 10 feet from the door, and then the disturbance faded as the path led into denser vegetation. I lost the trail in the underbrush. I went back to the door of the building. I considered trying to break the padlock. I had a small pry bar in my truck that I could have used. I considered going back to my truck and getting it. I decided not to. I decided that whatever was inside the building was not something I needed to see. I had come to the property to gather any information that could help me understand what had happened to Diane. The building was unfamiliar to me, was not on any official map, and was clearly being used for something. The building was probably related to the phenomenon. Opening the building would have been an investigation, and I had been given consistent advice by every source I had consulted that investigation of the phenomenon had consequences that were not predictable. I took photographs of the building with my phone. I took photographs of the disturbed ground. And I took photographs of the path leading from the building toward the lift line. I noted the GPS coordinates of the building using my phone's mapping application. I made notes on a small notebook I had brought with me, describing what I had observed and the date and time of my observations. I walked back down the service road to the access road. I walked back to my truck. I got in. I drove out of the property. I drove back to the motel where I had been staying. That evening, I tried to find Diane Castellanos through public records. I had been searching for her on and off for 3 weeks. I had not been able to find any record of her current location. I had found a few records of her past, including a property records search that showed she had owned a house in a suburb of Denver until 8 months earlier when she had sold the house. Yet the buyer of the house was a corporate entity that I was not able to trace through the records I had access to. I tried to find Wesley Kearns. I had a name and a description, and the information that he had moved to Phoenix to be near his wife's family. I searched for him using public records databases. I found a Wesley Kearns of approximately the right age in the Phoenix area. I called the phone number associated with the record. The phone rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. I left a brief message identifying myself as the new caretaker at Spire Basin Resort and asking him to call me back. He did not call me back. I called again the next day. Same result. I called for the rest of the week. I did not hear from him. The following week, I received a letter in the mail at my motel. The letter was postmarked Phoenix. Yet the letter was handwritten on a single sheet of yellow legal paper. The handwriting was careful and small. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the handwriting on Wesley's list. The letter was brief. It said, "Mr. Halverson, I cannot speak with you on the phone. The phone is not safe. I will not write to you again after this letter. I am writing to tell you 3 things. First, Diane Castellanos is alive. She is in a residential care facility in a state that I will not name. The facility is private. Her admission was arranged by people who have an interest in the property's continued concealment. Second, the building you found on the service road is the building where the personal items from the downhill chairs are stored. The building has been there since at least the 1970s, as by my understanding from the previous caretaker before me. The contents of the building have never been examined by any caretaker. The contents are, by every account I have heard, voluminous and growing. The building is locked because the previous owners locked it decades ago, and no caretaker has chosen to open it. Third, the next caretaker has been hired. The next caretaker is a man named Theo. He started at the property 8 days ago. He has not yet observed the phenomenon, by my understanding from sources I cannot identify. He will observe it on the next new moon, which is in 12 days. He has not been told about the phenomenon. He is alone at the property. I am writing to ask that you do something for him that no one did for me, and that no one did for any of the caretakers before me. And I am asking that you contact him directly and warn him. I am asking that you give him the opportunity to leave before the new moon. I am providing his contact information below. I am sorry that I am asking this of you. I would do it myself if I could. I cannot. The reasons I cannot are part of the situation I am asking you to help with. The letter included Theo's full name, a phone number, and an email address. The letter ended without a signature. I sat in my motel room and I read the letter 4 times. I considered the implications of what Wesley was telling me. Diane was in a care facility, having been admitted by people who had an interest in the property's concealment. The phrasing suggested that Diane had been institutionalized against her will in the same way that Frank Whitaker had been institutionalized in 1996, as after Frank had tried to report the phenomenon. The pattern was consistent with what Diane had told me about the previous caretakers who had not retired conventionally. The pattern suggested that there was an entity or a set of entities that was actively maintaining the concealment of the phenomenon, and that the maintenance involved suppressing people who tried to disclose it. The next caretaker was at the property. The next caretaker had not been told about the phenomenon. The next caretaker would observe the phenomenon on the new moon, which was in 12 days. The next caretaker would, by my own experience, observe the phenomenon as a single person in a remote location with no support and with no information about what was happening or why. Wesley was asking me to warn Theo. And Wesley was asking me to give Theo the opportunity to leave before the new moon. Wesley was asking me to do something that, by every indication, would put me at risk of the same suppression that had been applied to Diane and to Frank and to the unnamed earlier caretaker who had simply disappeared. I sat in my motel room for several hours. I tried to think about what to do. I made a decision. I decided I would call Theo. I decided I would warn him. I decided this for reasons that I want to be honest about, because I do not want to overstate my own moral standing in this story. I decided to warn Theo because I had been given the same warning by Wesley's list, and the warning had been useful to me, and I had been able to make an informed decision about whether to leave the property. The next 2 caretakers, the ones who had received the document in advance from Diane, had also been able to make informed decisions, and both of them had chosen to leave. Theo was being denied the same opportunity by the company's decision to not give him the document. Theo had a right to the same information that had been available to me and to the previous candidates. I also decided to warn Theo because if I did not warn him, and if Theo was harmed by the phenomenon, I would have to live with knowing that I had been in a position to warn him and had chosen not to. I had already lived with knowing that I had not done enough to support Diane's disclosure. I had written the statement she had asked for, but I had not followed up with her aggressively when she had stopped responding to my calls. Yet I had not gone to the bank or to the Whitfields or to law enforcement on my own initiative. I had, in some sense, allowed the suppression of Diane to occur without significant resistance. I did not want to add Theo to the list of people I had failed to support. I called Theo at the number Wesley had provided. The phone rang twice and Theo answered. He sounded young. His voice was friendly and curious. I introduced myself. I told him I had been the previous caretaker at the property he had recently started working at. I told him I had information about the property that I needed to share with him, and that the information was urgent. I told him I would prefer to speak with him in person rather than over the phone, and that I could meet him anywhere he wanted. Theo was quiet for a moment. he said. "Is this about the document?" I asked him what he meant. He said, "There is a yellow legal paper document on the kitchen table at the cabin. The document has my name on the front and is titled, 'For the Next Caretaker.' I read it on my first night. It is a list of 14 items. I assumed it was something the management company had left for me. I called the company about it the next day. The company told me they had no knowledge of any such document and that I should disregard it. They told me to focus on the standard caretaker handbook and to ignore any other materials that I might find at the property. I have been following their instructions. The list said some unusual things. I assumed the previous caretaker had been eccentric and had left some kind of personal note. I have been following the standard handbook and ignoring the list. I sat in my motel room with the phone pressed to my ear, and I tried to absorb what Theo was telling me. The list had been replaced. The list I had read, written by Wesley and addressed to the next caretaker, had been removed from the cabin sometime between when I had left and when Theo had arrived. A new list, addressed to Theo by name, had been placed on the kitchen table. The new list had 14 items, like Wesley's. The new list had been described to Theo as something to ignore. The new list had not been written by Wesley. Wesley had told me in his letter that he could not contact me on the phone and that he would not write to me again after the letter. Wesley had not been involved in producing a new list for Theo. The new list had been produced by someone else, and I asked Theo whether he had observed anything unusual at the property since he had started. He said, "Not really. The lift sometimes makes noises at night. I think it is the cables expanding and contracting with temperature changes. The cabin makes noises too. There are some animals around the property. I have not seen anything that I would describe as unusual. The new moon is in 12 days, by the calendar in the cabin." The list said something about a new moon, but the management company told me to ignore the list. I asked him whether he could read me the items on the list. I told him I needed to know exactly what the list said. Theo agreed. He went to the kitchen table. He picked up the list. He read me the items. The items were not the items Wesley had written. The items were different. The items addressed the same general topics as Wesley's items, but the specific content was different in key ways. The new item one said the lifts were operational and could be used by the caretaker for inspection of the upper terrain during off-season maintenance. The new item 3 said the maintenance room contained the main electrical panel and that the caretaker should familiarize themselves with the operation of the panel. The new item 4 said that the lifts might run on certain nights as part of an automated test cycle, and that the caretaker should monitor the test cycles and report any irregularities to the management company. The new item 5 said that the cabin was the caretaker's primary residence, and that the caretaker should feel free to move about the property at any hour. And the new item 6 said that any unusual observations should be investigated by the caretaker and reported to the management company immediately. The new list was the inverse of Wesley's list. Where Wesley had said, "Do not operate the lifts," the new list said the lifts were operational. Where Wesley had said, "Do not exit the cabin at night," the new list said the caretaker should feel free to move about at any hour. Where Wesley had said, "Do not investigate unusual observations," the new list said unusual observations should be investigated. The new list was, by every indication, designed to encourage Theo to do the things that Wesley's list had been designed to prevent. The new list was, by my understanding of the situation, designed to put Theo in the same position that Frank Whitaker had been in, and possibly in the same position that the unnamed earlier caretaker had been in, the one who had simply disappeared. I told Theo that the list he was reading was not the list the previous caretaker had left. I told him the previous caretaker had left a different list with very different instructions, and that the original list had been replaced after the previous caretaker had departed. I told him the original list had been removed from the cabin, along with the cabin logbook and other materials that documented the actual conditions at the property. I told Theo about the phenomenon. I told him about the lift running at night. I told him about the bags on the chairs. I told him about the items on the downhill chairs. I told him about Wesley's documentation going back 14 years. And I told him about the previous caretakers who had not retired conventionally. I told him about Diane and the disclosure she had been planning to make and her admission to a care facility. Theo was silent for a long time. He said, "Mr. Halverson, I want to believe what you are telling me. I also want to acknowledge that I do not know you, and that you are calling me with information that I have no way to verify, and that the management company has told me to ignore exactly the kind of materials you are describing. I want to ask you a question before I make any decisions. Can you tell me why I should believe you over the management company?" I told him I could not give him a definitive reason. I told him that the choice he was facing was a choice between two sources of information, and that he would have to decide which source to trust based on his own evaluation. I told him I would send him my contact information so that he could verify my identity and could investigate me on his own. I told him I would send him the name of Wesley Kearns and the contact information I had for Wesley so that he could try to verify Wesley's existence and Wesley's history at the property. I told him I would also send him the name of Diane Castellanos and the information I had about her so that he could try to verify what had happened to her. I told him, finally, that the most important thing I could tell him was that the new moon was in 12 days and that he had time to leave the property before the new moon, if he chose to do so. I told him that if he stayed and waited until the new moon, he would observe the phenomenon for himself and would then have direct evidence to weigh against the management company's denials. I told him that observing the phenomenon for himself was a high-risk way to verify what I was telling him, but that it was an option. Theo said he would think about it. He said he would call me back the following day. He thanked me for calling. He did not call me back. I called him the next day. He did not pick up. I left a voicemail. I called again the day after. Same result. I called for the rest of the week. I did not hear from him. 8 days after my call with Theo, 4 days before the new moon, I received an email from a different person at the management company. Yes, the email informed me that an investigation had been opened into my unauthorized return to the property and into my unauthorized contact with the current caretaker. The email said that my actions constituted harassment of the company and tortious interference with the company's contractual relationships, and that the company was considering legal action against me. The email asked me to cease all contact with the property, with current or former employees of the company, and with the bank that owned the property. The email said that any further violations would result in immediate legal proceedings. I did not respond to the email. I forwarded it to a lawyer I had retained earlier in the week, after I had begun to suspect that I might need legal representation. The lawyer reviewed the email, yet he told me that the company's claims were largely without merit, but that the company appeared to be willing to use legal threats to suppress my activities, and that I should expect the threats to continue. He told me to document everything and to avoid further direct contact with the property or with anyone associated with it. He told me to wait and see what happened. The new moon came and went. I did not hear from Theo. I did not hear from anyone at the property. The local news in the area where the resort was located did not report any incidents. The resort, as far as I could tell from public sources, continued to operate as a closed property with a caretaker on site. I called the local sheriff's office in the town near the resort. I asked, in a casual way, whether there had been any incidents at the resort recently. The deputy who took my call said there had not been any reports of any kind from the resort in the past several weeks. I thanked him and hung up. 3 weeks after the new moon, I received a phone call from a number I did not recognize. I answered. The voice on the other end was Theo. He sounded tired. He sounded older than he had sounded when I had spoken with him before. He said, "Mr. Halverson, I want to thank you for calling me. I did not believe you at the time. I should have. I am sorry I did not call you back. I have been processing what happened on the new moon. I am not at the property anymore. I left 2 days ago. I am at a motel in Grand Junction. I am going to drive to my brother's house in Boise tomorrow. I am going to stay there for a while." I asked him what had happened. He said, "Yeah, I will not describe it in detail on the phone. The phone is not safe. I will tell you that the phenomenon is what you described and that it has continued to escalate. The bags are larger now than what you described. The downhill chairs carry full bags now, not just personal items. The lift was running for almost 6 hours on the new moon, not the 4 to 5 hours that the previous records described. There is more activity at the loading area than there was when you observed it. I do not know how to describe what I saw at the loading area. I will say only that there are people there now. The people are loading the bags onto the chairs. The people are not, by my observation, individuals who could have driven to the property by ordinary means. I do not know where they came from. I do not know where they went after the lift stopped. Yes, I will not be returning to the property to find out. I asked him whether he had documented anything. He said, "I have video, I have photographs, I have audio recordings. I made the recordings during the night, from inside the cabin with the windows partially open. I do not know whether the recordings will be usable as evidence. I do not know whether I will share them with anyone. I do not know whether sharing them would result in the same kind of consequences that you described happening to Diane Castellanos. I am going to think about it. I am going to talk to my brother. I am going to make a decision over the next few weeks." I asked him whether he was safe. He said, "I think I am safe for now. The management company has been calling me. I have not answered. I have a lawyer who is communicating with them on my behalf." Yeah, the lawyer says the company is making the same kinds of legal threats that you described. The lawyer thinks the threats are not enforceable. The lawyer also thinks that the company has resources beyond legal threats, and that I should be careful for the next several months. I am being careful. I told him I was glad he was safe. I told him I would help him in any way I could, including providing testimony or documentation if he decided to disclose what he had observed. I told him to call me any time. He thanked me. He said he would be in touch. He hung up. I have not heard from Theo since that call. The call was 4 months ago. I have called him a few times. He has not answered. I do not know whether he is still at his brother's house in Boise. I do not know whether he has decided what to do with his recordings. I do not know whether he is alive. I have continued to receive occasional communications from the management company. The communications have been legal threats, vague warnings, and offers of payment in exchange for non-disclosure agreements. I have rejected all of the offers. I have not signed anything. My lawyer has been managing the communications. I do not know what is happening at the property now. I do not know whether a new caretaker has been hired to replace Theo. I do not know whether the phenomenon has continued to escalate. I do not know whether the bank has made any progress on selling the property. I have not driven back to the property. I have not contacted anyone at the property or in the area. I have been trying to live a normal life in a different state, yet where I have moved to a city where I do not know anyone, and where I have taken a job that does not involve property management or any of the other industries that might intersect with my previous experience. I am recording this story because I have come to the conclusion that the recording needs to exist somewhere in some form, even if I never publish it. I am going to put the recording on a hard drive, and I am going to put the hard drive in a safe deposit box at a bank in the city where I now live. I am going to leave instructions with my lawyer that the hard drive should be delivered to a journalist of my lawyer's choosing if anything happens to me. I do not know whether anything will happen to me. I do not know whether the management company or the entity behind the management company has any continued interest in me. I have been quiet. I have not tried to publicize what I know. I am hoping that my silence will be sufficient to keep me out of whatever fate happened to Diane and Frank and the unnamed earlier caretaker. If you are watching this, it means my lawyer has decided that something has happened to me and that the recording should be released. I want to use the time I have in this final part of the recording to say a few things to whoever is watching. If you are ever offered a position as an off-season caretaker at a closed ski resort in a remote location, please ask the property management company for the names and contact information of the previous 3 caretakers at the property. Please verify that the previous caretakers exist and that they are reachable. Please ask them about their experiences at the property. Please ask them whether they would recommend the position if the property management company refuses to provide the names or if the previous caretakers cannot be reached. Please decline the position. The refusal to provide the names is a signal that the management company has something to hide. The unreachability of the previous caretakers is a signal that something has happened to them. If you are ever at a remote property alone and you observe machinery operating that should not be operating, please do not investigate. Please return to your living quarters. Please lock the doors. Please do not look out the windows. Please call for help, even if the help cannot reach you in time. Please document what you observed in the most permanent form available to you. Please prepare for the possibility that the documentation may be the only record of what you observed, and that the documentation may need to outlast you. If you are ever told by an institution that something you have observed does not exist, or did not happen, or is not what you think it is, please do not accept the institution's account uncritically. The institution has an interest in maintaining its own narrative. The institution may be correct, but the institution may also be wrong, or may be lying, or may be participating in something larger than you can see. Please trust your own observations, while remaining open to the possibility that you have misinterpreted them. Please seek out other observers. Please look for patterns. Please document the patterns. Yes, if you are ever in a position where you have information that someone else needs in order to make an informed decision, please share the information. The cost of sharing the information may be significant. The cost of not sharing the information may be that the other person makes a decision they would not have made if they had known what you knew, and the consequences of that decision may be on you in ways you have to live with. Theo is somewhere. I hope he is alive. I hope he has decided to publish his recordings. I hope that somewhere the documentation of what is happening at Spire Basin Resort is accumulating in the hands of people who will eventually be able to use it. The phenomenon at the resort is, by every indication, ongoing. The bank has not been informed. The Whitfields have not been informed. The public has not been informed. The next caretaker, whoever they are, is, by my best estimate, currently at the property alone, reading a list of instructions that has been designed to lead them into the path of something that has been operating at the property for at least 60 years, and that is, by every indication, escalating. I am going to stop recording now. I am going to put the hard drive in the safe deposit box. I am going to live as quiet a life as I can manage for as long as I am able to manage it. I am going to hope that I am wrong about the people behind the suppression, and that they have lost interest in me, and that I will be allowed to live out my life without further consequences. I am also going to hope that, if I am wrong about being safe, and if this recording is eventually released, the release will contribute to the situation finally being addressed. I do not have confidence that the situation will be addressed. The situation has persisted for at least 60 years through several generations of caretakers and property managers and owners. The situation has survived the bankruptcy of the Whitfield family and the transition of the property to the bank. The situation has, by every indication, infrastructure and resources that go beyond the property itself. I do not know what the situation is. I do not know what the bags contain. I do not know where the bags go after they reach the top of the lift. I do not know what is in the building on the service road. I do not know who the people are that Theo observed at the loading area on the new moon. I do not know how the caretakers are being identified and recruited and silenced. I do not know what the entity behind the suppression wants. I do not know any of these things. I know only that I observed something I cannot explain, that I tried to escape from it, that I was given information that allowed me to leave with my safety mostly intact, and that I have spent the past 5 months trying to honor the information by warning others and by documenting what I know. I have done what I could. I am going to stop now. If this recording reaches you, please do something with it. Please share it with someone. Please add to the documentation. Please continue the work that Wesley Kearns and Diane Castellanos and Theo and I and the previous caretakers, going back to the 1960s, have been doing in different ways to make the situation visible. Yet the lift runs at night. The bags go up the mountain. Someone, or something, needs the bags to reach the top. The someone, or something, has been doing this for a long time. The someone, or something, has resources to suppress people who try to interfere. I do not know how to stop it. I do not know whether it can be stopped. I know only that the documentation needs to exist and that the documentation needs to be released, and that the people who have been working to maintain the documentation deserve to have their work continued by whoever comes after them. I am going to stop now. Thank you for listening.